The Group of 20 Summit wrapped in New Delhi, bringing together world leaders to coordinate policy for the global economy. Now, despite concerns that disagreements over the Russia-Ukraine war would get in the way of a consensus for the first time, the G20 leaders have agreed on a joint declaration. What came out of the trip for Seoul? For further insights, we're now joined by Professor Byung-joo of the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Good morning, Professor Kim.
Good morning.
Let's begin with the G20 summit before making our way in what came out of the ASEAN summit. The G20 is, from where I stand, largely an economic-focused summit. What were the most notable achievements for President Yoon?
I guess following his trilateral summit in Camp David last month, August, ASEAN and G20, these were all multilateral summit. And I think for Korean president, it was important to position this country in the proper, way, going over and beyond this country's focus on its diplomacy and diplomatic ties with the United States and Japan. So, working together with the ASEAN, several countries in the Southeast Asia, and also working together with the world's leading economies, G20, in India, that was very important balancing act in a way, making it clear to the world that Korea is not just into building relations with the United States or Japan, but also it cares about its position and it cares about its contribution and, its potential to make making contribution to making the world a better place altogether. That was very important, steps that had to be taken by Korean president. And in India, G20, since we're talking about G20 first in India, several different things President Yoon did. For instance, he, expressed different kinds of commitment for Korea for, making contribution to the climate change cooperation. Korea, he announced that is going to make contribute a lot more money to the Green Climate Fund, for instance. And also, Korea is going to send more money, economic assistance to Ukraine, for instance, as a responsible global member. And what's interesting was on the sidelines of G20 also, President Yoon led a meeting called MICTA. It's a gathering of five states. They're kind of like a middle power. MICTA stands for Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey, and Australia. So these are all G20 members, and Korea actually initiated the idea of MICTA, the gathering of five middle power states, back about 10 years ago. And now he led the gathering to celebrate the 10 years of MICTA at the time of this occasion of G20 in India. So all together, all around, basically, to answer your question, what was happening was making clear to the world that Korea senses is very much aware of its position in the world and is very committed to taking active role in a way to contribute to the world community. So that was a very important gesture to offer to the world community, I should say.
What can we also say about the relevance of G20 at large these days, in particular reference to the recently enlarged BRICS, for instance? Unlike the G20, Xi Jinping did attend the BRICS Group summit in Johannesburg.
Right, exactly. What the observers seem to see these days is kind of the world increasingly being divided into two camps. And what you're mentioning right here, comparing G20 with BRICS makes that point as well, addresses that point right there. Because G20, if we look back, was created as a unified world community response to the 2008 world financial crisis. And the 2008 world financial crisis means kind of ending of a globalization era where everything was going kind of robust and gung-ho about, world market being unified and economy going up continuously. And then bam, there was a 2008 worldwide crisis. And in response, for example, US President Obama led the world community's unified response to this global crisis by getting together 20 largest economies of the world. That was back in 2008. Now, over time, especially in recent years, particularly from the time, let's say, about 8 years ago, 10 years ago, let's say, I guess it was about 8 years ago or so, BRICS came out, UK leaving EU, and then Donald Trump coming into White House, and, kind of world beginning to going its own ways. And then a few years ago, 2 years ago, Russia invading Ukraine. Of course, before then, China did different things to Hong Kong. And now we're hearing about Taiwan crisis and all that. So basically, in response to your great question of G20's relevance, I would say what we have seen since the creation of G20, which kind of signified one world unified, we've seen the world getting divided. And clearly, what we saw in Johannesburg recently at the BRICS gathering was these 5 BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, adding 6 additional members to their group, BRICS group, making it 11. Right. The new members, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, Egypt, Argentina, and Ethiopia. And so, they're kind of presenting these 11-member BRICS as an alternative to the US and Europe-led world in a way. And so there was a real trouble in many different aspects. And so to answer your question in a very brief way, yes, indeed, there's a issue about relevance of G20, and it's being raised really strongly these days. And then the alternative may be the other side, what they want to present is a BRICS.
Right.
And 11 enlarged BRICS in a way.
Because G20, unlike its initial founding, perhaps purpose, a lot has changed in the decades since. And this BRICS counters G20's interest is sort of non-Western alliance. I mean, the fact that President Joe Biden was at the G20 summit, but Xi Jinping was not, it does make that divide even more distinct. I mean, there were other reasons why perhaps Xi Jinping was not in Jakarta. However, the conversation seems to be deepening as we speak, because it does seem like the United States wanted to sort of encourage shoring up lines of credit for smaller countries by bolstering World Bank's lending power, which would, of course, in turn counter China, that has historically been a reliable creditor for these poorer nations. So the tug-of-war seems to continue. Today's questions are so massive, but because, again, a lot of grounds to cover. Also, before the G20 summit in New Delhi, President Yoon attended ASEAN summit in Jakarta, Indonesia. So what were some of the most important gains made in Indonesia for Seoul?
He did so many different things. Of course, when we talk about ASEAN, the congregation of major Southeast Asian countries and economies, they've been there for a long time. In my recollection, ever since the 60s. But in recent decades, their importance have grown big time. With the rise of China and the changes of China's status, the spreading of the globalization, ASEAN have become very, very important entity. And recognizing the entity, let's say about 2 decades ago, I'd say, when I was with the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a diplomat, ASEAN agreed to create ASEAN Plus 3. ASEAN nations getting together to meet with the head of states of Korea, China, and Japan regularly. So with ASEAN in place for decades, ASEAN Plus 3 was added, meaning that Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia are working together there. And so that has become a very important, vehicle for cooperation. And in addition to that, basically what President Yoon was doing was showing his respect for ASEAN's cooperation and the recognition of the importance of ASEAN at this gathering, but also being a key participant in ASEAN Plus 3. And then there's the East Asian Summit. There's several key heads of the states, including the United States, kind of like getting together to talk about the issue of Asia Pacific altogether. So it was Southeast Asia plus Northeast Asia, and then Pacific region all together at the three different levels. And Korea had to make its mark. That's what President Yoon did. In addition, of course, President Yoon did this time to sign a FTA with the Philippines, which is a very, very important step forward. And also he, articulated several points of cooperation with very important nation, Indonesia. Indonesia's importance, there's no question about it. For the past several decades, there was China, there was an important basis for cooperation with Korea. After China, there was Vietnam as a new basis. Vietnam has become a country that produces the largest amount of Samsung mobile phones, for instance. And then after Vietnam, there came Indonesia. And this time, President Yoon signed different kinds of agreements of cooperation, economic, environmental, technology, various kinds of cooperation with Indonesia. So he was pretty busy this time attending ASEAN gathering.
Dr. Kim, here's another analysis. Would you agree with the statement that the current geopolitics has dramatically elevated the importance and maybe even significance of ASEAN?
Oh, yeah. There's no question about that. And that's because the point I have made earlier, right? China first came to Korea as a very important country to work with several decades ago, as China then was emerging as the world's factory as well as world's market. And after that, Korea saw China getting kind of saturated in terms of its capacity to receive Korea's products, Korea's, the stage, and expand cooperation with Korea. Korea's focus moved on to Vietnam. That's when the importance of ASEAN came into focus first. And as I said, after that, Indonesia was added. But along with that, we know how important Singapore is, for instance, as a hub of economic exchange and financial flows. And these days, technology improvements and so on. So ASEAN has become important over the past several decades, but particularly with changing China. The face of China has changed big time ever since the post-Deng Xiaoping years. Then nowadays, Xi Jinping era, China has become a very different kind of nation. And for that, we have realized the importance of not only economic side, but also strategic. When China claims South China Sea there, the channel of transportation, for instance, the sea line transportation going through, Singapore and Malay Straits, for instance, how important this has become. And, the strategic importance of Philippines, for instance, as a possible base countering China when there is uncertainty in Taiwan, for instance. So economic, strategic, all these different aspects, ASEAN has become a very important, location, geopolitical location. And many people seem to believe these days in Korea as well, as Korea faces all these long-term challenges, economic and, population challenges and so on. But those people who are thinking about future seem to see a lot in the future of ASEAN that could mean greatly for the next generation of us, the Koreans, as a place to work and as realize their dreams for their future career and professional plans and so on. So.
From the past week's ASEAN and G20 meetings, because there's a pretty long list of sideline meetings that we couldn't get to at least all of it today, what would you say are the most important key takeaways for South Korea?
I guess relating to the initial points today that we talked about, after all these efforts being made to strengthen our ties with Washington and Tokyo so significantly, this was a very important occasion for Korea, ASEAN and G20. And in a way, like I found it very interesting and intriguing indeed. For instance, what happened at G20 this time, as compared to G20 last year. Last year in Bali, the world was really unified in a way, kind of criticizing Russia. And they called what was happening in Ukraine as the war against Ukraine. But now, this time in New Delhi, they changed the name for what's happening in Ukraine. They called, instead of the war against Ukraine, they called the war in Ukraine. And the tone and manner, the way the G20 participants were dealing with Ukraine situation was changing pretty fast. So we realized how volatile the international discourse and perspective in dealing with global issues can be, and how different countries may face different kind of new challenges as the mood and reaction of world community changes to particular issues. So more than ever before, we realize it's really, really important to be in the center of this interaction, cooperation, and communication. And in that regard, I think Korea did a good job doing its best to make its mark in this newly important group of ASEAN, this time in Jakarta, and also making its mark in New Delhi at G20. Despite the fact that there are a lot of people who seem to question the relevance of G20 in this fast dividing world. But still, Korea did its part, right? Making its mark as an important power among the world's largest 20 economies of the world, and showing its commitment and, its devotion to important issues of the world. So that's what we did. And then we have been reminded there are all these different dimensions of diplomacy, bilateral, as well as regional, as well as multilateral dimensions of diplomacy that Korea, as an important world power, has to actively participate. And I think that's what was demonstrated this time.
Actively and to hold on to that seat. I mean, despite its criticism that the relevance of G20 might be slipping, doesn't mean that, a group of 20 still needs to hold BRICS accountable, and that balance is still being struck. So the complicated nature of international relations, we always appreciate it, Dr. Kim, and these were massive conversation topics. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
We'll speak to you again next week. If you're listening to our program using the podcast service, just a reminder that we do go live Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Korea Standard Time. So tune in and help us make the show more informative by giving us your input. See you bright and early on Good Morning Seoul.